Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk about why you might want to consider raising Leghorns for eggs. In particular, I'm going to talk about the 5 pros of why you might want to consider Leghorns, and many of those pros we considered and were the reason why we ended up purchasing mostly Leghorns for our first laying flock. But also the top 3 reasons why you might want to hold off and reconsider. And there is one reason in particular that we figured out and that led us to the decision that we are not going to raise any more Leghorns, at least not on our current homestead. But I want to give you a little bit of background on how we ended up with Leghorns and our experience with them. So we decided to add egg layers to our homestead in we decided in 2020, late 2020, and we finally got our chicks from the hatchery in early 2021. When we decided to have laying hens, I just called the hatchery and said, hey, what are some of the breeds that would work for us, just based on the requirements that we wanted to have as many eggs as possible. I mean, that was really the number one requirement, right? If you want to produce eggs, you want to have good egg layers. Second, we told her we live in central North Georgia, so they should be okay with relatively hot and humid temperatures, but also with mild to moderately cold winters. And we want to pasture raise them. So they're going to be out on pasture, and they should be good foragers. And the lady on the phone said, well, Leghorns, are an obvious choice because, most of the white eggs that you find in the grocery store are from Leghorns. So a lot of the commercial egg producers use Leghorns for their white large eggs because they are such prolific egg layers. They produce 250 to 300 eggs a year. And in addition to that, she said, well, maybe cinnamon queens and Rhode Island reds, try those out. So we ended up purchasing, I think it was 8 Leghorns, 5 brown Leghorns and 3 white Leghorns. I think it was just based on the availability. A couple of 3 Rhode Island reds and 3 cinnamon queens. And throughout the 2.5 years of their egg laying career, we learned a lot of things about those different breeds, and in particular about the Leghorns. And so let's go through some of the pros associated with Leghorns, and then we talk about some of the cons, and one con in particular that I mentioned before that you really might want to consider depending on how you want to raise them and the size of your lot that you have. So let's talk about egg laying. I mean, Leghorns are by far one of the most prolific egg layers on the market. They, as I said, lay between 250 and 300 white large eggs per year, and they also tend to start laying a little bit sooner than many of the other breeds we've had. So we've been raising Rhode Island, cinnamon queens, Americanas, red stars, all kind of different breeds of different colors and different egg colors, green eggers, Australorps, Marans, Plymouth Rocks, actually one of my favorite ones as well, and Bielefelders. And by far, I would say the Leghorns produce the most eggs. They start laying earlier. So when they are pullets, the first eggs we got were white eggs from our white Leghorn pullets. All of our brown egg layers started laying a couple of weeks later and less frequently in the beginning. The Leghorns also tend to lay for longer, depending on, their feed and the environment, of course. But overall, they're just incredible egg layers and one of the main reasons why I want to consider them. Number 2 is their climate adaptability. So they're also fairly hardy birds. They do very well in warm or hot temperatures, probably also because of their Mediterranean Italian heritage. Leghorns originated from Italy, and then they were fine-tuned, etc. in the US and in Britain. But originally they come from the Mediterranean, so they are certainly used to warm temperatures and humidity. And they've been doing incredibly well here in Georgia, where it gets very hot and humid in summer. And they also do fairly well in winter. I mean, here in Georgia we have fairly mild, to moderate winters. We see some snow, some freezing temperatures, but it's not very often. But I would argue that even in colder temperatures, where winters are longer and colder, the Leghorns do fairly well. So overall, I would argue you can raise them anywhere within the continental United States, and they'll do really well. The only thing we do in winter for them, for all of our hens really, we close the windows of the hen house on at least 2 sides, so there is no draft. In cold temperatures we keep them dry, obviously, but beyond that, just the low ambient temperature doesn't seem to be affecting them at all. They're also fairly disease resistant. So assuming that you provide them with a clean environment, either by using deep litter method or by cleaning out the hen house frequently, letting them pasture, and providing them with high quality feed, they do very well. In fact, even in less than ideal environments, in the beginning we made a couple of mistakes with our deep littering. We didn't add enough carbon to accommodate the amount of ammonia or the amount of nitrogen in the chicken poop. So that led to a lot of ammonia buildup, and that was certainly less than ideal. We also had some issues with the organic feed we used in the beginning that wasn't quite the right mix, we figured out later. So that led to some health issues, but the Leghorns were the least affected ones. The cinnamon queens and the Rhode Island Reds were much more affected than our Leghorns. Ever since, we really improved our deep littering method. We add, carbonaceous material in the form of wood chips or pine shavings or hemp bedding every week to make sure that we, have enough carbon for the amount of nitrogen in the poop, and that has, resolved all the issues. We also swapped the feed. We are now feeding an organic low PUFA feed that uses olive oil instead of the typical vegetable oil to reduce the omega-6 content. Reduce inflammation, keep the hens healthier, much like, what we do for ourselves as well. And that has, fixed all of those issues. But even, as I said, in less than ideal conditions, the Leghorns seem to be doing fairly well. They're also incredible foragers. So we pasteurize our birds. They have about a quarter of an acre, or at least that flock for, 20-some birds or whatever. They have a quarter of an acre to forage. That includes both pasture and wooded areas. And they do an incredible job in scratching and eating grubs and worms and insects, and also plant material, clover and whatever they find. They do very well, and, to not only fertilize, the area, but also to remove pests and weeds. Number 5, they're also fairly aware to predators. And, since they're pasteurized in our case, they're aerial predators. They're, especially hawks in particular. They're raccoons at night. And so we've had quite a few fatalities, unfortunately, over the years, mostly due to hawks. There was only one kill by a raccoon where a hen, actually a brown Leghorn, didn't make it into the coop at night before the door closed. And so she spent the night outside. And then, as you might know, chickens have poor night vision. So once it gets dark, they don't really move much. You can just go there and pick them up or eat them, if you're a predator. And so unfortunately that hen died. But everything else, as far as aerial predators are concerned, most of our losses were from other breeds. The flightiness and the skirmishness of the Leghorns appears to be very conducive to getting out of harm's way if there is a predator in sight, especially if you hear the rooster, crow. We've had mostly so far white Leghorn roosters, and they do a very good job at alerting everyone. And the Leghorns are the first ones, under cover and out of harm's way. And some of the other more docile breeds, they just walk around, they take it easy, they have a lot of fun until the hawk comes, and then, it's game over, unfortunately. So, that's one thing. If aerial predation is an issue, or predation in general, Leghorns might have, no pun intended, a leg up. So those were the 5 reasons why we really like Leghorns and why we've added them to our flock in the first place. And that was already the reason, because we did so well with the first flock, that we added 20 more white Leghorns for our second flock. And that changed everything. And that really made us understand what some of the issues are with Leghorns in comparison to some of the other breeds. And number 1, the biggest negative of the Leghorn, in my opinion, is the temperament. Meaning that they are super flighty, they are skirmish, they are not very docile, all of which is good for evading predators, but it's a pain in the butt if you want to contain them, or if you need to treat them, if you need to pick them up for something, be it, clipping their wings or whatever the case might be. You're going to have a hard time, catching them. But more importantly, they tend to not respect any sort of fencing, even if it's 5 or 6 foot high. Like in our case, our perimeter fence is 5 feet high, and our chicken fencing that contains them within, an area within the perimeter is 48 inches or 4 feet tall. And they just fly over it. Even if you clip both of their primary flight feathers, once they're old enough, because they are so light, they can still get over that fence, or at least fly up and then hop down on the other side. And we've been chasing Leghorns, on our neighbor's property, which butts up right to ours. It's just a perimeter fence separating our property from the neighbor. And our neighbors are not farmers, so, they are, just residential folks trying to enjoy their backyard. And they don't, necessarily like to have, chickens pooping and scratching and, doing all the things that chickens do on their side of the property. And so we've been chasing them and catching them and, In the beginning, obviously, while they're still pullets, we didn't want to clip their wings because they were still developing, so we wanted to allow them to fully feather out before clipping the primary flight feathers, which doesn't hurt them, obviously. But until then, for a few weeks, it was just a pain in the butt. From the time they were tiny, they either escaped through the relatively wide mesh, even for the chick fencing that we put in that has very small mesh wire, because the Leghorns are so tiny, they slip through everything. They escape whenever they can. They fly on top of things on the roof of the henhouse, etc. And then from there they fly over. They just use every opportunity to escape and go where they're not supposed to, even though they have, I would argue, more than enough room. I mean, we offer them like 500 square feet a bird, which is significantly more than the best pasture-raised birds, commercial birds, out there. They don't care. They just go wherever they want to. And so it becomes a chore to keep them contained. And that's just not a good thing. And that's one of the reasons why we said no more Leghorns on our current property where we have size constraints. In other words, on our new property that we haven't moved to yet, we have 48 acres, and if we put them somewhere in the middle and just let them roam, they're gonna stay within the perimeter. They only roam so far. But on our property, which is just 1.25 acres, and we have, a limited area where the chickens can be, it's a pain in the butt. In comparison to most of the other breeds we've had that just are happy enough to stay contained, maybe also because they are heavier and are less likely to fly or too lazy to fly because it takes too much effort and maybe they don't get as high. And so the other breeds, most of them, there are some like the green eggers, they are more prone to like trying to escape. But most of the other heavier breeds, the Rhode Islands, the Cinnamon Queens, the Bielefelders, the Plymouth Rocks, they just stay put. And they are very easy to handle. And so that's the number one reason why we decided on our current property not to have any more Leghorns. They just take too much time, running behind and chasing. The second thing is their robustness. And by that I mean, their body weight is relative. They are light birds. They are incredibly small birds in comparison to maybe a Rhode Island or a Cinnamon Queen or a Bielefelder in the extreme scenario. The Rhode Island or the Leghorns are pretty small and lightweight. And so if you think about it, laying an egg takes a lot of resources out of the bird. Everything has to be, or most everything has to be right for them to lay eggs consistently, like every day, ideally, at least during, the spring, summer, and maybe early fall. And so if something is not quite right, if they don't have the resources they need, there is not a whole lot of wiggle room or extra, I guess, they are not walking around with a pantry, like with additional resources they can draw from if they don't get what they need from the environment. Let's say if there is something a little bit off with the feed, if there is maybe something a little bit off with, maybe less sunlight, whatever the case might be, it seems like it's affecting the Leghorns more just because of their, lighter weight and less resources they're carrying around than some of the larger breeds. That's just an observation. There might not be a scientific rationale behind it, but at least that's what we've seen. And so, again, under ideal conditions, I mean, in our case, we feed, organic, corn and soy-free feed, low PUFA feed from New Country Organics. We give them kelp. We give them crushed eggshells. So we basically recycle, the eggshells that we, get from the eggs we collect, and also oyster shells, and give them all of that to make sure they have all the resources they potentially need. Except for artificial light, we don't do that, so they can keep laying, And if you do that, you're likely not going to have an issue, but in less than ideal conditions, you might see the egg-laying potential being negatively impacted. Number 3, as I mentioned, is their size. And that's not necessarily a bad thing from a, if you want to keep only egg layers, but if you plan on maybe, butchering them at the end of their egg-laying career and turn them into, meat, there is not a whole lot of meat on that Leghorn. We butchered our Leghorn rooster not too long ago because it's gotten too aggressive, and we thought it was a huge bird. But once the feathers were gone, I mean, the carcass was tiny. Nothing compared to anything you would find in the supermarket. And most people know that egg layers, even though, some people would argue Leghorns are dual, purpose breeds, I would say they are, egg layers, and I wouldn't raise them for meat as meat birds. But the thing is, with the smaller birds, because they're so active, they run around a lot, at least if they have the opportunity, the meat is incredibly flavorful. And that's always, very often the case. The more active a bird is, the more flavorful it is, but probably also the tougher it is because the muscles were used more. And in the case of the Leghorn, it's very little meat. But for chicken stock, for chicken soup, excellent. We made stock the other day from some of our old Leghorns. Absolutely delicious, super flavorful, and with a good amount of fat, but just not a whole lot of meat. So with, those are the 3 reasons, but for the 3 cons, really, there's only one that I would seriously consider as a real downside, and that is their temperament, depending on how you want to raise them. Now, if you want to keep them enclosed, either in a chicken coop with an attached run, or maybe one of those mobile chicken tractors with, egg-laying baskets like, Joel Salatin does for his meat birds, you're not going to have any issues with their flightiness, etc. They might not be, they are never going to be pet birds, at least most of them. There's only been one hen, one of our Leghorns that were super docile that I could pick up, and even a rooster until at the very end where he became super aggressive. For the most part, I could pick him up, I could pet him, and he was perfectly fine. But Leghorns, generally speaking, are not, pets. They're flighty, they're skirmish, they just want to be left alone and do their thing. But if you want to raise them enclosed, the flightiness is probably not going to be an issue. Go for it. They lay a lot of eggs, large eggs, high quality eggs. But if you want to pasteurize them and you have only a small area that you want to fence in, be aware that you're likely going to be chasing Leghorns a lot. And if you don't want to do this, then the Leghorn might not be the perfect breed for you. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. I also want to mention I have a blog post that goes into a little bit more details, answers a couple of more questions related to Leghorns in comparison to, some of the other breeds like the Rhode Islands. But with that, we're going to wrap up this video. I hope you like it. If you have any questions, let us know in the comments. If you didn't like it, let us know as well so we can do better in the next video. Until next time.